You're listening to the History Things podcast, a conversational approach to discussing social, industrial, maritime, music, and military history. Join us and our special guests as we dive down the rabbit holes of your favorite stories from the past. Follow the History Things podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or online at Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Be sure to leave a review and a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast app. Pat and Parker are coming right up. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoy the show.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the History Things podcast. I'm your host, Pat McGuire, joined, as always, here in the War Department studio by the Grandmaster himself. That's right. Knows Kung Fu better than Bruce Lee.
Oh, definitely
and
don't
Chuck
say
Norris
that.
combined. Ladies and gentlemen,
Please
I'm talking
don't say
about the
that.
co-host of the show, Matt Borders. Matty B, how are you? Welcome back.
I'm good, but it's always a pleasure to be here. We've got a great topic this evening, this afternoon, whatever you want to call it, and it's going to be a good time.
I know you're trying to be humble right now, but your Kung Fu skills on a scale of 1 to 10?
Never.
0?
Fencing, we can have that conversation, but
you don't think you could do like a strong karate or like judo chop?
No,
like Austin Powers?
I did a very unfortunate version of karate when I was very young,
my God.
and it was not good.
No backflips in the studio today?
No, absolutely
All
not.
right, that's a shame. So today I'm excited because we are going back to a century that I am professionally pretty familiar with, and not a story that we often get to tell here on the History Things podcast. So we are traveling back to the 18th century. We're going back to the ending of the colonial era. We're becoming a country, man.
We are?
We are. We're breaking away from an empire. And to help us tell the story, which we'll get to in a second here, we have to introduce our esteemed guest. We have worked with this gentleman before. We have been friends with him for some time. We have done the live show.
And reenacted.
We've done reenacts. Right. We have held the line.
That's right.
Vive la France.
Vive la France.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the History Things podcast for the very first time. Public historian Travis Shaw, how are you, big guy?
Oh, man, I'm doing great. It's exciting to finally be here. We've been talking about this for like 2 years now.
Yeah, probably
Yes,
about 2
yes,
years.
we have.
Yeah.
When did we do the first Historians on Tap?
Ooh.
That was about 2 years ago, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think
you guys-
I think the anniversary just rolled through.
I'm still stuck on the murder story you told.
Oh, yeah.
Like, I was so grisly.
We'll have to do another episode.
Yeah.
just
I always
on that.
think about it around this time of year because it's like, what's grisly? It's like, oh, those murders, those Frederick County murders. Travis, why don't you go ahead and tell the listeners just a little bit about you, how you got into history, sort of what kind of work you do, and then what we're going to be talking about here today.
Sure. So I'm a Maryland native, grew up right in Frederick County, just outside of Frederick. And that's really where my love of history came from. I mean, it's a beautiful historic landscape. You've got all these great 18th and 19th century buildings. You're right in the heart of all this Civil War action, all this 18th century action. So it's just all around me. And thankfully, I had parents that really pushed that too. You know, we'd take vacations to museums, to battlefields, historic sites, and just became a huge part of my life. And I've been doing it ever since.
So
Nice.
having a, I guess, a interest that spans histories, do you have one that's like, this is more my jam than the other?
I mean, if I was to have one period that's my jam, it's definitely the 18th century. I'm
Yes.
a Rev War guy,
Yes.
as you guys know.
Yes.
But that doesn't mean I'm just a Rev War guy. I'm kind of like ADD when it comes to history. I get in these little like
I think a lot of us are.
you like jump down a rabbit hole and you follow that up for like a month or two and
Right.
then you find something else. So
That's the best way to be.
yeah, absolutely. But I always keep coming back to the Rev War period, and I guess that's what we're going to talk about today is Maryland and the Revolution.
So let's talk about that. It's a good transition because here's the simple question I have for you. How does that even happen? Because our state doesn't have too terribly much going on in it physically during the American Revolution, right? Like there's no huge grand battles that are fought here. Armies will pass through from time to time, but it's not like one of the states or colonies that you think of when you think of the Revolution. You're thinking of basically all the New England, Pennsylvania, and the Carolinas.
Right. You know, I think
Georgia's like, don't leave me out.
Yeah, I was going to say Georgia too.
Georgia's like, please don't leave me out.
There's some nasty things going
But
on
yeah,
in Georgia.
so like, how did you get into this here in Maryland?
I mean, I think that was just kind of a natural collision of my two interests. Like, I love the period and I love local history. You know, with my job at the Virginia Piedmont Heritage Area, like our whole thing is taking these big national events and bringing them down to a local level. Tell the local stories, the local people, local places. And so it's real easy to do that here in Maryland with the Revolutionary War. Even though there are no battles here, Maryland plays a critical role in everything else that's going on.
So let's do this then. So, we are a British colony. We are not one of the for-profit colonies. Maryland's colonial history is kind of interesting when you compare it to Virginia or some of the others. How does Maryland get to, independence? It's one of the more reluctant states. It kind of, pussyfoots around in the Congress a good bit. So how does Maryland go from being this, British colony that at one time was one of the key places to defend, the empire, and then how does it go to breaking away?
I mean, to really explore that, I think we need to look at what Maryland looks like in the 1770s in terms of culture. Maryland, and my fellow Marylanders are going to hate this. Maryland is kind of a place caught between two much larger, much more influential colonies at the time, Virginia and Pennsylvania.
Right.
And we see that reflected in Maryland's culture at the time. The Tidewater region, the area around the Chesapeake Bay, very much like Virginia. It's dominated by this planter class, kind of more conservative, kind of more, they're reliant on plantation, agriculture, enslaved labor. They are kind of tied to England through the ties of the Anglican Church. And then the further west you get in Maryland, the more it kind of shifts to what you'd see in Pennsylvania. Like out here where we're at right now in the studio, this area is very much more heterogeneous. You've got people coming down from Pennsylvania. You've got Germans. You've got different religious groups, Scots, Irish. You've got dissenting groups, your Baptists, your Methodists and everything. And
can we touch on that for just a moment, Travis?
Yeah.
Because I think having not been from Maryland originally, the mindset of a lot of the rest of the country, at least from the Midwest, is, Maryland's the Catholic colony. But that's not really the thing for very long.
No.
I learned after coming here. But would you mind touching?
Yeah.
I know that's pulling things back a little bit further, and I apologize.
That's all right.
Well, we got time for Governor Sharp today. We can talk about whatever you want today, man.
So going back to the 17th century, Maryland was founded as a proprietary colony by the Calverts, and it was supposed to be this kind of safe haven for English Catholics. And, here in Maryland, we like to pat ourselves on the back that there's this declaration of religious tolerance that occurs at that time. That, like you said, doesn't last too long. By the end of the 17th century, Protestants have firmly taken control of the colonial government. They'd always kind of outnumbered Catholics in the colony. And so by the 18th century, Maryland is just another kind of dominated by the Anglican Church, and the same kind of social class and social groups that you see in Virginia and other southern colonies.
So we're just another British colony at that point.
And that's a good thing to know, though, because I wanted to know how that process occurred, so I appreciate the details.
I mean, we can really get into it if you want, but that might be
this is your ship right now. Travis is at the helm. Dude.
Yeah, I mean, going back to the 17th century, there's a tremendous amount of conflict between kind of the Catholic ruling class in the colony and I said the bulk of the people who are Protestants. We're talking about all those indentured servants that are coming in, the people who are actually doing the work, and many of the landowners are also Protestant, and that's going to erupt during the English Civil War. There's fighting at the Battle of the Severn near Annapolis, and that's a point when Protestants really start to begin the ascendancy in Maryland, and by the time they move the capital in the 1690s to Annapolis, that's really a power move to say we are no longer tied to what's going on at St. Mary's. We are a Protestant colony. Annapolis, named after our Queen Anne, is going to be the city and the center of power, both church and state power.
I'm from here. I've never really connected why that move of the capital happened. That was so succinct and perfect. And now I'm like, I know everything about Maryland now. I didn't before, but I do now.
Thank you, Travis.
So then by the time of the 1750s, they're just kind of, which is the story I get to tell every day at work, they're just kind of operating business as usual. They're one of the British colonies at this point, and all eyes are on everything going on with France. So we go from this moment where we have been started as a colony for, I don't know directly and fully, but definitely on the religious, tolerance, ticket, I guess you could say in the modern sense. It's dramatically changed by, a full century later. And then suddenly they're just part of the British Empire machine. And then suddenly we're breaking away from it, even reluctantly. But like, how do we do that when we go from building forts in the western frontiers to stop this French attack to going, you know what, maybe we should just do something different and not be a part of this empire anymore?
Well, I mean, it's a story that I'm sure you're familiar with telling. After the war, who pays for it? Who pays for all those forts on the frontier?
Right.
I think it's us. I'm pretty sure it's us.
Yeah.
And you're going to see kind of very similar protests happening in Maryland as the protests that are happening elsewhere. One of the famous events that we commemorate up in Frederick is, with the repudiation of the Stamp Act.
Right.
The first big kind of protests against British taxation happened in the 1760s. We have these 12 judges in Frederick who repudiate the Stamp Act and lead this kind of popular protest against that kind of taxation. You're going to see other things pop up. Over in Annapolis in 1774, the Peggy Stewart affair. I don't know, you guys are
not super familiar.
So this has to do with the tea tax. There's
Okay.
a ship coming to Annapolis, the Peggy Stewart, and it's carrying, among other things, tea and indentured servants. And when it pulls up into the harbor in Annapolis, nobody wants to let the cargo land because it has tea in it, and you're not supposed to pay the taxes on tea. We've got this big kind of popular protest of non-importation on British tea, and the owner of the ship, in order to get those indentured servants off the ship, pays the tax on the tea, and the mob kind of goes nuts over this, and he actually is pressured by the mob to burn his own ship once everyone's off it, of
Right.
course.
Yeah,
got to
still.
get those guys off. But kind of bends to the will of the mob and burns his own cargo ship as kind of penance for paying this tax on the tea, even though it was kind of something he had to do. Those people had to get off the ship at some point.
So let's clarify this then for our listeners, because I think this is a disconnect a lot of people have with connecting our, 18th century stories between the French and Indian War and the Revolution. A large portion of the things that set this all in motion is this immense debt that the British colonies incur. But is it everything? Because it's not like, because it's not a secret where I work. That fort is an interesting outlier in all this because it's not a British-built fort. It's a Maryland-built fort. So it's like the colony did that from top to bottom. So when the British are coming back for money and things that, we've all agreed to during the French and Indian War to repay, it's not places like Fort Frederick. They can't be asking because that wasn't the king, the parliament had no say in that. But is everything that sets us into this path just this fact that we, in a nutshell, we're not doing the best job during the French and Indian War defending ourselves? We acquired this debt because the army's coming, these fortifications are being built, and then we got to pay it all back. I mean, in theory.
I mean, I think one of the big missteps that the British make is kind of treating all of the colonies as kind of this one big monolithic lump. I mean, obviously there is distinction there in British policy, but in general, Maryland, we talk about the frontier of Maryland. The frontier of Maryland isn't really, compared to Pennsylvania or Virginia or the Carolinas, it's not really a thing. Maryland doesn't have to spend a ton on frontier defense.
No, and they don't even want to.
Right.
They don't even want to.
Yeah, Virginia and Pennsylvania have already cut them out of the westward expansion game.
Sure.
So, no, it's easy to kind of say, oh, it was taxation or, paying for the war or whatever. There's a lot of social issues that are going on here too. I kind of talked about the divisions within the colony.
Yeah.
You have, especially in Western Maryland, a large number of people that don't speak English. We've got Frederick is a largely German city in the 18th century. They don't worship at the Anglican church, yet they still have to tithe to the church.
Sure.
You have in the Tidewater all these fabulously wealthy planters that are living high on the hog, but they're crazy in debt to, typically in the Chesapeake, Scottish tobacco factors. So, running up credit. There's a lot of discontent coming from almost every level of society.
All right.
Yeah.
So Maryland gets to, witness some of these big national, we'll call them now, kind of national moments. Right? We have the Stamp Act. We have the repealing of the Stamp Act. Do you go right from that to the Boston Massacre? How does Maryland start to react to the things that really set this grand thing in motion? Or is Maryland still very focused on how it's being affected locally?
That's a tough question.
It's the only kind I ask on this show.
Right.
I'm a very serious person. Our listeners know this.
Maryland, like you've kind of alluded, is a little late to the game, and I think it's because Maryland is politically dominated by such a small class of people. You could look around and it's the same names. It's the Taskers, it's the Ogles. You have the Daniel Delaney the Younger.
I was going to say, right, the Delaney's, the Beatties, important families.
All of these big families. Delaney's actually a really good person to talk about because when all this protest is happening, he's writing newspaper articles kind of siding with his fellow Marylanders, saying, no, this taxation isn't cool. This is not just. This is not how we should be treated as British subjects. I think the break for him and for many people comes once the shooting starts. He's kind of the mind that he gets labeled a loyalist today because he says, basically we need to cool down. We can protest this. There are ways within the system that we can get what we want.
I was about to literally ask about this because he does end up being, quote, a loyalist. But like, what does that mean? Because I never get the vibe that he's like for the king. I think he's just more like, this isn't the way to get what we want.
Yeah, I mean, to put yourself in the mindset of someone here in the colonies in the 1760s, 1770s, I mean, you've got to imagine you've just won this massive worldwide war against the traditional enemy, France.
Would that be World War One at that point? Technically,
yeah.
World War Zero,
World War Zero, World War -8. Because what is a world war?
Right.
So you've won this big war against England's enemy. England is now the most powerful kind of commercial empire in the world. You're a subject of this empire. Most English people at the time would consider themselves the freest people in the world. I mean, you look at what's going on in like France or Prussia or Spain or Russia, any of these other major world powers. I mean, they would consider it despotism. We're talking about absolute monarchies. At least in England or in Britain, you have kind of a constitutional liberty and a tradition of that.
Representation.
Right. I like to joke that the American Revolution is the most British thing imaginable because I couldn't see it happening anywhere else because we have this whole tradition that Americans have been fed for generations at that point, or colonists have been fed on, coming out of the Magna Carta, coming out of the English Civil War, and where does the power of a king end and the power of the people begin? And you do have a tradition of elections, even if, it's only a small sliver of people who are actually voting.
Right.
The ideas are there that there are certain rights that are afforded to Englishmen. And that's kind of where Delaney comes down on. He's like, we are Englishmen. We have this system. It's not perfect, but it's the best system we've got going. And, I think for Delaney and a lot of other people who end up being loyalists, there's this fear of mob rule and anarchy. If we just let everyone kind of have a say, then things are going to go to hell pretty quick.
You summarized that perfectly. Our revolution is us being more British than the British.
Yeah, exactly.
Take that, King Charles. Anyway, so these protests start happening. He's British. King Charles. He's the current king. Don't make the face at me.
I thought we were talking about the first
one.
I
mean, we can do that. Look, we can do Charles. We can do George. Pick a king out of the hat. They've got 5 names. They're just like, what do you want to be this time?
I didn't realize you'd gone modern era. I apologize.
Well, I mean, we got to because, we have a pretty sizable listener base in the UK.
We do.
We've got to let them know that we're still paying attention to them. Okay. We know who their current monarch is, not all their old ones. It's statistics, Matt. All right, so protests are happening. Do we get... So I know I just asked. So we have things like the Boston Massacre, occur, and that is a big. I don't want to sell it too short and just call it this big propaganda piece because the image that goes around is a lot different than the reality of the moment. But you start to see other people kind of paying attention to something that everybody has kind of felt was a New England problem. When does this start spreading down and become a Pennsylvania problem? Because we asked this same question of David Wood, who's the director of the Concord Museum up there. And he had a pretty straightforward answer that, 1770, 1773, whatever, blah, blah, blah. But he picked a very specific moment when this really bled down fully into the rest of the colonies. So where for you does it start to bleed out of New England and like really infect Maryland.
For me, it's going to happen after the massacre, and it's going to happen with the British response, the intolerable acts, or the so-called intolerable acts. Shutting down the port of Boston, getting rid of civilian government in Boston, stationing troops in Boston to keep the peace. That's a moment when a lot of people throughout the colonies start to realize, if they can do this to Boston, then they can do it
to anything,
to anywhere. In Philadelphia, they could do it in Annapolis, they can do it in Norfolk, wherever.
That's quite literally the sentiments of David Wood. He was like, it's the 74 closure of the port when things change across the board, because it can happen anywhere at that point.
Yeah, I mean, you see this rash of resolutions across the colonies, basically these committees getting together and writing out these resolutions, stating their opposition to these acts. But also, and I think this is super important, stating their solidarity with the people of Massachusetts. I mean, we're talking at a time when someone in Maryland or South Carolina or Pennsylvania has nothing in common,
right,
with someone in Boston.
We're these individual countries almost.
Right.
We
individual colonies for sure.
Sure.
Yeah, totally different culture, totally different economics, different religions, different languages in some cases, and yet here we are saying, we will back the people of Boston with our blood and treasure if that's what it takes. And I think that is a huge step towards creating like this American identity. Something like you said, we're not individual countries or colonies anymore. There's a common bond that we all share.
So before we move ahead, I just want to backtrack for another half a second here, just because we're kind of looking at how Maryland is reacting to some of these, quote, larger scale national things. Knowing that the Boston Tea Party is incredibly symbolic, but doesn't accomplish too much, there are sympathetic tea parties that happen in other places. Do we have one here in Annapolis?
So the Peggy Stewart affair that I mentioned earlier is kind of the most direct version of that we have in Maryland. I mean, there's a broader non-importation movement that's going on. Chestertown over on the Eastern Shore, they have a tea party in some way, shape, or form. I don't want to step on anyone in Chestertown's toes, but it's been built up a lot. But I mean, it's emblematic of what's going on throughout the colonies, that there are these less well-publicized protests that are going on.
The 250th of that event just occurred, last December?
I think so.
I think it was.
Oh, the Boston Tea Party?
Yeah.
Yep.
Kevin Pollak was out there for that.
Was he chucking tea in the harbor?
I think he might have been. I think he might have been involved with the actual program.
I would like to get him on and just ask him, did you chuck the tea? Was it you? Was it you, Kevin?
But I mean, yeah, you see it throughout the colonies. I mean, there's kind of stepping back a little further up in Rhode Island, the burning of the Gaspé, this British revenue cutter.
Is that how you say that?
That's how I pronounce it.
I always read it like Gaspy, and then I feel like a child because I'm like, I'm just dumb.
You have to pronounce it French.
Gaspé. That's right. I didn't think about that.
Yeah.
You're right.
Think about Newville.
So when I think about France, I go to a different century. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah,
up in Rhode Island, God knows how they pronounce it. But,
you're right.
But yeah, I mean, it's all part of this wider movement that's going on across the colonies. We see it in every single colony.
So the port gets closed then, and everybody starts to, hit the panic button. Like, whoa, that can happen in Boston. It can happen to us here in Annapolis. It can happen all up and down the Atlantic, coast. So, but that's not it's not the ultimate red line, because I know that Maryland still is going to take its time easing into the pools of the rebellion. Like, if this is a rebellion that's hot, it's a cold water pool for Maryland, because they're dipping in slowly.
Cold water pool. Nice.
Marylanders are quick to join the other colonies in war. They're not as quick to join in the actual idea of independence.
So they're ready to fight but not do much legislating?
Nice.
And what I mean by that is, in 74, when all this is going on and things are really ramping up, Maryland kind of overhauls its militia system to build up minute companies, just like we see the Minutemen up in New England or in Virginia. When the shooting starts, Marylanders are going to be some of the first non-New England troops on the scene. They raised 2 rifle companies in what was then Frederick County, Maryland, basically everything from Carroll County west.
Right, exactly.
And they're going to be raised, June 14th, 1775, Congress authorizes the creation of these Continental rifle companies, and those companies will assemble in Frederick later that summer, and they'll march up to Boston. They're in Cambridge like 20 days later. They do this.
That's the Beeline March.
The Beeline March.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, we don't want to take it away from the Virginians. But yeah, it's the same march. It's the
No,
same company.
why can't we take it? Virginia wants everything. Why can't we just try to take it from them?
The good people of
It's true.
Shepherdstown, West Virginia, will be very upset. They own the Beeline March.
They
but
do.
but it's the same thing. You know, it's those companies are raised at the same time. They all step off within a few days of each other, and they all arrive in Cambridge within a few days of each other. And this is a tremendous moment. Again, when I talked about American identity, we call it the Continental Army. It's not continental until this moment. You know, it's a New England army.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But once Virginians start rolling into camp, once Marylanders and Pennsylvanians start rolling in, it's, you know, I mean, I can't even imagine what that would feel for the guys in that camp to know that everybody else has got their back too, that these resolutions weren't just empty words, that people are ready and willing to fight. So, and that's, you know, obviously not the only foray into military stuff that Marylanders make, and we can really get into that if
Let's
you want.
do it. So, I mean, but let's do it, because what I don't want to do is just run through the names, dates, places, sort of like the timeline of it, because like we can go right from here to now. Lexington and Concord have happened, and now they're flooding in, all right? So all, like everything you're just talking about, and then we can go boom, Valley Forge. But like I would like to just spend some time talking about how Maryland, both militarily, kind of is working itself out and legislatively, because, you know, we are among, I think at one point, don't we abstain when people are actively voting? Like, we're like, I don't even want to touch that yet.
Right.
I mean, look, I can generalize Maryland in a lot of ways, but Maryland politically, sports, militarily has followed a kind of tradition for centuries now of like non-committal.
Kind of the middle ground.
Yeah, just kind of like running both sides of the fence
And
as long
on
as
that
you can.
note, actually, that brings up a question I've wanted to ask since the conversation started. Does Maryland fall in that traditional view of the rest of the colonies of the Revolutionary War? And again, this is from someone who was born in Midwest and has that Midwest education, things like that. But it's often been portrayed for me as a third of the folks in the colonies wanted the revolution, a third of them didn't want the revolution, wanted to be loyalist, and a third of them just wanted to be left alone.
Is that Adams?
Yeah. Adams is the one that kind of popularizes that view. And you know, actually, I'm glad you asked this, because loyalism is kind of my thing.
Right on.
So I can speak to this with some authority. You know, kind of the modern scholarship on that is that Adams is a little off on his maybe overstates loyalism a bit.
Oh, really?
You know, kind of most modern scholars of loyalism, and there's been a lot of great work in the last decade or two. Really, maybe 20% of the colonies are actively loyalists.
Okay.
And you know, by actively loyalists, they're doing some,
Like they're doing counter work.
Yeah, they're
to the,
right. They're either
right.
enlisting
supporting
in
the
British
cause in some
Army
way.
or
Yeah.
supporting the cause materially,
Right.
or however. And you know, again, we have to. You can be an active loyalist. You can join a loyalist regiment. Maryland forms a battalion of loyalist troops.
Boo.
Yeah, they have a fun story. And you know, but there's also kind of passive loyalism. You know, like if you stop paying your taxes, if you refuse to give supplies to the army, or you know, if you're kind of gumming up the works of the Continental Army or the Continental Congress, you're not necessarily taking an active role, but you're still doing something to help your cause.
Yeah.
And you know, Maryland is interesting. I wouldn't be able to put it like a percentage on it. One of the reasons I think that loyalism isn't as huge of an issue in Maryland as it is in many other colonies is loyalism tends to be strongest when the British Army is nearby.
Oh, sure. That makes sense.
You don't want to come out and support the king and have all your neighbors know where you
Right.
stand.
Until
then-
you've got some backup
But
there.
then you make that play and you got to stay with it, because once that army leaves, everybody now knows who you are.
Exactly. And that's why we see, you know, huge numbers of like loyalist refugees coming out of New Jersey and the Carolinas, New York.
Yeah.
The British Army doesn't really, I mean, other than a few days and during the Philadelphia campaign, never comes through Maryland, you know, other than the very northeastern tip. So there's never an opportunity. Those few loyalists, like I said, there's a loyalist battalion that's formed. They have to flee Maryland and get to Philadelphia before they can even enlist.
Where are they formed roughly from?
All over. There's guys from largely from the Eastern Shore, kind of the Tidewater area. Again, because that's the easiest way. You know, it's a lot easier to get to Philadelphia from the Eastern Shore than it is from Frederick or Cumberland or wherever.
Right.
Do Do we find more of the loyalist sentiment coming from the people more attached to the aristocracy in the colonies?
Loyalism comes in every shape and form. I mean, loyalists are coming from every walk of life, every economic background, every social background. It's a really extremely complex phenomenon to study. Kind of in the wider sense, you do see a lot of people who are loyalists because they're just very conservative. They don't want to lose what they have, especially if they're higher up in society. But you also see plenty of poor loyalists, people who are associated with the maritime trade. If your entire life work goes into getting ships to and from England and that trade gets cut off, what do? You see a lot of different ethnic groups who, we talk about a lot of Native American tribes side with the British because it makes more sense. The British are their best bet at guaranteeing their territory. A lot of African Americans, enslaved African Americans, will join the British on the promise of freedom. You have religious groups like the Quakers who refuse to take sides because of their religious beliefs and end up getting forced into loyalism. Many Quakers get arrested. A lot of those pacifist groups in Pennsylvania and Maryland and Virginia get arrested during the war.
I got a Quaker house 100 yards from my house that was 1730s when it was built. Do you know anything about them?
I don't know anything about that.
I do have another local question. When we get to the 1781 year, I do have another question for you, but a local one, but we'll get there. There's a theme that I'm picking up as you're talking right now. Sounds like a lot of this is rooted in the maintenance of status quo.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And it sounds it's a lot. I don't want to speak as broadly as it might come off, but it seems like people are less interested in the ideals of everything happening and more in just the preservation of the way they are currently living.
I think that is the case for a vast majority of people who you consider loyalists or pacifists or neutrals. Is right. As I said before the war, they're living as subjects of the greatest nation on earth, and then all of a sudden we're going to take a leap in the dark and try to figure this out in a whole different system. And
but they don't know that.
No, I know.
Right? Yeah, it's impossible for them to see into the future that it's all going to work out. And there's so many times during the revolution where it looks like this is the end of the road.
Yeah.
And that it could all go wrong. And I think for a lot of people, there's a lot of loyalists, there's this deep conservatism that we have a system, it works all right, we can make it better within the system. We don't have to break the system and start all over again.
Do we see soldiers who have joined up with this New England Army and now turn it into a Continental Army? Do we see them sort of leaning into the concepts of independence and stuff like that faster than we're going to see those who legislate for it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think one of the biggest vehicles towards kind of normalizing the idea of American independence or really pushing is the Army itself. I mean, these guys are literally the ones who are putting their lives on the line. In most cases, people who are enlisting in the Continental Army are people that have very few opportunities anywhere else. We're talking about landless tenant farmers, out of work apprentices, and people like that. The kind of people who you say, well, we'll pay you and we'll feed you and, we'll give you a set of clothes to wear. That sounds like a pretty good deal. And if you survive, we'll give you your own farmland. That's so for these people, I think there is an incredible stake in American independence. I mean, that seems like a really stupid understatement, but their entire future depends on whether they are able to pull this thing off. And, we see it in other wars too. There's also the phenomenon of, even if you're not fighting for the cause, you're fighting for the guy next to you.
Sure.
Yeah.
And we see that over and over and over again in the writings of revolutionary soldiers. These guys, once they're in the army, they're in it for their comrades.
So how does Maryland get on track to going from I'm not super into it, I'll send my sons to fight for it, to we're going to vote for this thing on July 2nd? Independence Day should be July 2nd.
Yeah.
Right. we all
everybody
agree
at this table agrees.
I just,
honestly, this is not something that I'm probably super qualified to talk about, but from my perspective, it seems very much a case of that's the way things are headed.
Okay.
Maryland kind of gets, as I said, overshadowed by its neighbors. And, once Virginia's on board,
Maryland's like, cool, us
yeah,
too.
we can do it. And that's not to downplay the role of Maryland's delegates to the Continental Congress. Charles Carroll in particular, he is on board from the get-go. Maybe not necessarily on board with independence, but he is one of the most outspoken, before the war, he's one of the most outspoken people protesting against all these British acts. He's writing all these things. Him and Delaney get into all sorts of like a back and forth in the papers where he's kind of accusing Delaney of being too slow and too conservative and not willing to go the extra step. So it's not to downplay them, but I think, Maryland is one of those colonies where once the writing's on the wall and once their neighbors are good to go, that they're willing to put their lot in.
You brought up Charles Carroll, famous Knight Templar.
Mm.
Yeah, that he was one of those Masons that hid the treasure.
Oh, is there now?
Do you know The Secret Lies of Charlotte?
Yeah.
Same guy.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Also, our only Catholic
That's true.
signer of the
That's true.
Declaration.
That's true.
And the last surviving. Really.
Right, because that's when
That's right. He is. Yeah.
that's when Benjamin Franklin Gates' ancestor had to meet with him while he was dying. Because remember, he went to see the president to tell him the secret. Matt, haven't you seen the historical documentary?
Yeah.
National Treasure.
National Treasure.
Oh man, I wish that was a true story.
It would be a lot of fun. Yes.
So, all right. So Maryland finally gets itself there, I guess you could say, right? So, through a lot of legislating, through, some indecisiveness, at one point abstaining outright from one of the procedural votes that kind of would set this in motion. But the day arrives, they sign it. Maryland is all in. What is Maryland's first sort of look on the battlefield like? Is it just kind of doing periphery stuff while New England shoulders the weight of this fight, or does Maryland go just charging right in, and just start eating lead?
So Marylanders are in the fight almost from the very start. As I said, in the summer of 1775, we get Maryland riflemen up in the camps around Cambridge.
So they're involved with the siege of Boston.
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's what I was. So, when are they first fighting?
Yeah, we have two officers from Frederick County, Thomas Price and Michael Cressup. And
Cressup's rifles.
Yep,
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. They're going to lead their companies up. They're going to join the army outside Cambridge. They're going to be involved in the siege of Boston. There's a lot of, at first, excitement that these Southerners have arrived. Washington is overjoyed that these people are here. Like I said, it's kind of a physical manifestation that this is a continental cause. That doesn't last long.
All right.
A lot of the New England soldiers kind of resent the lax discipline of these guys. These riflemen who are from the frontier parts, they don't want to listen to orders. They don't really want to do all the fatigue work that goes into a siege, digging trenches. And
They're like,
things that.
digging these trenches is whack, hon. I don't want to do it. And they're like, what are those stupid accents, Maryland?
So it'll like degenerate into fistfights. Like guys will be arrested and things like that. At one point, I forgot which continental. There's a New England officer, and I'm blanking on who actually said this, but he's like, I wish they had never even come at all. These guys are more trouble than they're worth. Is basically what he says.
Wow.
Damn.
Yeah, because they get like excused fatigue duty. So you can imagine if you're some like Massachusetts farmer,
Marylanders get
digging-
excused.
The rifle companies do.
So now it looks like favoritism from Washington for his Southern troops.
Right, and so this is bad blood. I mean, like we said, these guys have nothing in common, basically. Those rifle companies the two Maryland companies end up going with Washington's army down to New York. Once the British evacuate Boston, their enlistments will run out. Most of them will re-enlist, and they'll create kind of a Maryland-Virginia Rifle Regiment.
Bingo.
Yeah,
Yes,
I was going to
know
say your
about
boy
these.
Moses
Yes,
Rawlings.
Moses Rawlings.
Yeah, he's one of the officers in
Right.
one of the original companies, and he rises to command of this rifle regiment outside of New York. And they're going to play a big role in the fighting around New York in that summer, as well as probably the most famous Maryland story, that of the Maryland troops, the Immortals. Yes, yeah, the Maryland 400, Maryland Immortals, Smallwood's Maryland Battalion. So
This is where our state nickname comes from.
yes,
Yeah, the old line.
the old line. Yeah. So these guys, Smallwood's guys, aren't a rifle company. They are like a traditional infantry company or a regiment that's raised in Maryland, volunteers, and mostly from like the Tidewater area. Smallwood himself, he's a planter from Southern Maryland, so kind of that top rung of society.
They will, however, get guys from all the way
All
out
over.
west.
Yeah. Their light companies recruited in Frederick County.
Like we're
so-
currently
right on.
researching some stuff, and I'm like, how are these guys ending up all the way out there? Like they're coming from like west, like way west
Yeah.
of where I sit at work every day. I'm like, dude, like how'd you even get the memo to sign up?
Right. So yeah, that'll be like kind of Maryland's first big contribution on the battlefield. They're going to be part of Washington's army outside New York. August of 1776, the British land on Long Island, and through this kind of big flanking maneuver, push Washington's troops out of their positions and back to their entrenchments on the Brooklyn Heights. And in order to buy time, Smallwood's Marylanders and some Delaware troops are going to be thrown into the breach and told, hold on as long as you can so we can get everyone else
You're
out.
being sacrificed.
You are being sacrificed, absolutely. They are the rear guard of Washington's army. And, it's kind of immortalized as the 400. It's a little bit of a misnomer. There's probably just over 200 guys there.
Right.
Which makes it
Really?
even
Even-
crazier.
yeah,
it's like
even worse.
250, 280 guys probably.
Now, I do have a technical question on that, and I apologize for derailing. 19th century is my thing. What is the paper strength of a regiment supposed to be during the Revolution?
It depends on the colony and the time we're talking about, but usually ballpark about 700 guys.
Okay. So still way under strength.
I have another question relative to this moment that might tie to a previous era for some of these people. So why Maryland? Like when he's got to make the flight from Brooklyn, are Maryland troops the only troops in the position to pull it off? Are they?
Sounds like Delaware was there too.
Oh yeah, I mean we can't. But like today, everybody kind of forgets Delaware exists.
I'm trying not to be that guy.
But like, how does Maryland end up in that position?
It's just wrong place, wrong time.
Because I'm also wondering. Well, I'm also
For them.
to be you.
For them.
Well, I'm also wondering because Marylanders, for whatever reputations they have had this reputation for being pretty grisly and good fighters, because during the Forbes expedition, a lot of the officers in 1758 are remarking like these guys are, quote, some of the briskest woodsmen they've ever seen. So like these guys know how to fight. And I'm wondering how much of that, 20 years later, Washington doesn't have a lot of love lost for his rival colony that he's squashed, but he knows who can fight. And I'm wondering if that plays into it at all. He just remembers.
There's absolutely something to be said for that. I mean, Smallwood's, the kind of the core of Smallwood's force are guys that have been in training for years. I mean, Smallwood made sure that these guys were drilled pretty hard before they joined the army.
Nice.
Many of them had been in militia companies before the war, so that kind of command structure was already there.
Right.
So there's certainly, I mean, I don't know if anyone knew at the time that they were going to, achieve glory on that day, but they had a reputation for being solid troops at the time.
Cool.
They were well equipped. Again, Smallwood's super wealthy. These guys had nice uniforms and things like that.
This is the brown, the brown coat.
Oh yeah, let me ask this: is it brown with red or is it blue with red coming out of Maryland?
So initially, a lot of Smallwood's guys are in red coats.
Really? Oh,
Which
that's
is kind
interesting.
of crazy.
Yeah.
But
Just
I
like
mean,
generic red or like actual British military red?
like in basically British style military
Ooh.
coats. Because again, a lot of these guys came from very wealthy, well organized, well supplied militia companies.
Which were British previously, not too long
Exactly.
ago.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
But I mean that's probably changed by the time they're in action at Brooklyn. They're probably in hunting shirts and things like that.
Because that's what when Moses Rawlings ends up in my professional world, we're kind of wondering what they're wearing because there's not a lot of record of it. It's like we assume it's a smattering of a lot.
Yeah, buddy, we're all wondering what they were wearing. Like, this is the hardest part about kind of reconstructing the 18th century materially is like the records aren't there, the existent objects aren't there, like there's no photos.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, they're probably in a smattering of
Right.
uniforms. I mean, I know that not that these gospel truth, obviously, but Don Trelawney just did a fantastic painting a few years ago of the Marylanders kind of crossing the Gowanus Canal there during the battle, and they're in like all kinds of different colored hunting shirts and things like that.
Cool.
So, but yeah, that's kind of Maryland's first real contribution in terms of continental troops. But of course, there's a militia that exists in Maryland. There's Maryland state troops. Maryland has a state navy along with state Marines, which is
That's
kind of
fun.
a cool rabbit hole to go down.
Yeah.
There's during that same New York campaign, Washington creates what he calls his flying camp.
Mhm.
And this is kind of a generic term for like a mobile reserve. And his plan is to pull up 10,000 militiamen from Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, so forth. And so Maryland will actually take volunteers out of their militia companies to go and serve for 6 months up there. And those guys, some of the flying camp guys, are going to see action, at the Battle of Harlem Heights and some of the fighting in and around New York City that summer. There's a local rifle company out of Frederick under the command of Peter Mance who goes into action at Harlem Heights. So we're there. Like I said, kind of from the beginning, we've got these rifle companies, we've got the Continentals, we've got the guys in the flying camp for a few months.
What happens to George's army if Maryland doesn't save the day?
Oh, boy.
I love that you put it that way, too.
I mean, there are so many times in that particular campaign in New York that Washington's army could have been destroyed.
Yeah, well, we're talking about this time.
But this
it's the time where Maryland saves the day. Well, I guess what I'm asking, taking all the joking off of it, is a failed stand there going to result in the complete annihilation of Washington's forces?
Certainly would have made it a lot harder for him to regroup his army in any semblance of order. I mean, that's really what they're doing. The Americans have entrenchments up on the Brooklyn Heights. They just need to get their guys there.
Yeah.
And, the stand of the Marylanders absolutely buys them time for that.
All right.
So
Nice.
I'm not going to go as far as to say like they won the revolution there, but
I'm surprised because you're a Marylander, and I mean that's our moment.
trying to be realistic here.
No, I know.
This guy does not.
Like
I
a
do.
true Marylander, I'm playing the middle of the road here. So,
How
yeah,
strategic.
I mean, it would have turned a terrible defeat into a disaster.
Well, because I also wonder.
That's a good way to put it.
So
yeah.
here's maybe a different way to ask that question. While you might not have gained independence by making that stand, could the war have been lost? Because if Washington's army does get crushed, whatever, things are going to dramatically start changing in the conversations of the Continental Congress that's meeting and things like that. So there's more to lose than there is to gain, I guess, from the success or failure of that stand?
I mean, it's important to remember these battles are happening just a few weeks after independence has been declared.
Right.
We're talking August of 76. So the die has already been cast.
Right.
So a crippling defeat to Washington's army at this point is probably.
And it wasn't a great day to begin with.
No, that whole campaign is just defeat after defeat after defeat for Washington. Outside of Harlem Heights.
Right.
And the Marylanders play a huge role in just giving the army a chance to survive that day.
It's funny
we're
how
going to see it again a few days later when Washington moves his troops across the river to Manhattan. The Marblehead Regiment from Massachusetts, they ferry the guys across in the fog. Had that fog not been there,
Yeah.
had the weather been bad,
Yeah, good
had
point.
Washington's guys been trapped on Long Island, like who knows what would have happened.
Had he not had Marylanders to get them to that moment
Right.
just a few days later. Anyway.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Jesus.
Hey, look, I got a character.
No,
play.
state pride is fine.
That's all right. We're not shaped like a mitten, all right? So not everybody can do the cool hand gesture. Did I get it right? Am I doing it right?
Yeah.
Oh, I get the thumb.
As long as the thumb's going off
thumb
to
goes
the right,
up,
you're good.
that's mitten.
Yeah,
the thumb goes out. Does it
No
go
way
that
you
way?
can do Maryland with your hand.
No,
Exactly.
no. Well, it's like kind of like finger guns, but it's not even good. It's weird. There's a crab in there somewhere.
Kind of like West Virginia's, honestly.
Yeah, West Virginia.
All right, so getting to the battlefield, right? Maryland has now, they've shown up. They've created this great moment. Washington's been able to get away. What happens to the guys that physically make that stand? Like, because I know a fair bit about that, but for our listeners who don't, like, are they all killed? Are they all captured? Some get away? Some made of Revlon?
Some, yeah.
some get away. I mean, the vast majority of those guys are casualties. I mean, killed, wounded, or captured that day. What makes it particularly tough for them is they make these two kind of, I don't want to call them assault, counterattacks against the British.
Right.
Under overwhelming numbers. They're outnumbered like 10-1. And then they have to pull back across this very swampy piece of ground. And, that's going to hold them up. And a lot of those guys are going to be, killed or captured right there. The vast majority of them don't make it out. But again, that's not all of Smallwood's regiment. It's just a part of
Right.
it.
The reason I ask is because, when Moses Rawlings shows up in the story we tell at work every day, he has just recently been a POW. and he's coming with a huge portion of the Maryland Virginia Rifle Regiment, who is also a POW. So I'm wondering are they grabbed in this stand or are they grabbed after it?
They're grabbed a little later on in the campaign. In November, the Rifle Regiment is part of the garrison of Fort Washington, which is like way up on the tip of Manhattan, kind of the last toehold the Continentals have on the island. And they're going to be just completely overwhelmed by primarily Hessian soldiers. And there's this great account from one of the Hessian officers talking about the kind of the drawbacks of a rifle. I use this a lot when I talk about kind of material culture stuff. One of the advantages of a musket over a rifle is it's a lot quicker to reload.
Right.
And he actually says, these poor guys with these rifles, they're getting off like one shot every 15 minutes. I mean, he's exaggerating.
Yeah.
But he says, by the time they're reloaded, they're feeling our bayonets already. Like these Germans are already up on them in the siege lines, or the entrenchments, not siege lines.
There's a great book on Hessian troops in the American Revolution that goes into quite a bit of detail on that, the attack on Fort Washington.
And it's absolutely brutal. I mean, it's hand to hand. Some of these Marylanders and Virginians are hitting Germans with rocks and stuff like that. I mean, it is an absolute hand-to-hand slaughter, and when the fort falls, Rawlings and most of his men are POWs.
It's just connecting, a little bit of dots, because if you come out to the site I work at, we don't tell the Rev War story a lot, but it does have a beginning before it arrives at the fort, and that's this battle at Fort Washington. So, how does Maryland fare going, through? 1776 is going to be a hard year. One of the things I was getting ready to say is I think the average person who engages in history, or especially this story in history, doesn't really realize that 1776 wasn't a fantastic year for the Continental effort. When I'm kind of BSing with my friends, I'm like, we do two things right. We declare independence and then we cross the river on Christmas. It's basically the extent of the positive things that happened in 76.
Yeah, everything other than that is just a disaster.
Washington's do I have a job? Am I losing my job? So how do they fare through that? Are they just kind of like everybody else, just kind of going with it, suffering, and then when do things start to work out in a? I don't know what I'm really asking there, but how do we move through that tumultuous year 76?
How do we get past this?
Because it sucks.
Yeah, it sucks bad. It's really the Army's going to turn things around in 77 when they completely reorganize the entire Army. There's what's known as the 88 battalions. So basically they look at the 13 colonies, they look at the size of them, the population, and kind of determine from that how many regiments they need to send to the Army. So Massachusetts, Virginia, they're on the hook for 15 regiments. Maryland has to put forward 8. What they'll do is 7 infantry regiments, and then they get half credit for the Maryland Virginia Rifle Regiment, because half those guys are Marylanders. And they also get half credit for a regiment called the German Regiment.
What?
Which is a super fascinating, again, rabbit hole we can go down. It's
Germans.
It's recruited from Pennsylvanian and Maryland Germans. And the idea is, honestly, it's part propaganda, kind of the idea of we talk so much about the Hessians and, the Germans fighting against us. We need to give the Germans here in the colonies something that they can kind of rally around.
That makes sense.
And so they form this regiment. Obviously it's mostly Western Marylanders in that. But, between all of those different formations, Maryland meets its quota. And then they add a few additional regiments. Congress authorizes a bunch of additional regiments. Marylanders are going to be present in Gist's additional regiment, Grayson's additional regiment, all these other kind of continental regiments. And using this completely reformed, basically a brand new army, Washington's going to go into the 1777 campaign season. So this is the army that goes into battle at Brandywine and Germantown. The story of the Marylanders at Brandywine isn't necessarily the most uplifting part of the story.
Well, can we tell it?
Sure. So
it's not all roses in the past,
Yeah, I'm going to give you Brandywine in 30 seconds.
All right, let's do it.
Washington's making a stand along Brandywine Creek. It's kind of the last natural barrier between the British and the city of Philadelphia. The British again kind of get the drop on them. They hold the bulk of his forces at the creek with this feint, and then they move most of the British Army way around on this big 17-mile flank march to get behind Washington. And Washington doesn't react until, they're already basically in his rear. So he has to react very quickly, and he's going to send 3 divisions of troops kind of up to hold as long as they can while he pulls the rest of his army around. And one of those is going to be a division of Marylanders. They are temporarily under the command of a Frenchman. Oh God, what is his name? Like totally forgot his name. Why did I forget his name? A French officer who is not the overall commander that they're used to. When they need to reposition themselves in the face of this British attack, he gives this overly complex maneuver. He basically tells them to like go on this big counter march instead of just, shifting right a little ways.
Mm-hmm.
And so as they're in the middle of this maneuver, the British attack hits and they basically just melt.
Understandably so.
Yeah.
Yep.
I mean, what are you going to do?
Right.
So that's not necessarily a high point for the Marylanders, but they will redeem themselves later on. At the Battle of Germantown, they're going to play a pretty big role. Maryland militia is also present at Germantown. One of the few times they kind of serve outside of Maryland. There's some guys that are pulled up into that fight. The real kind of, when we think of the Maryland troops as the old line, that reputation is really going to be earned in the South.
When they're down with
really?
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Nathaniel Greene's army and stuff like that.
Right,
Okay.
yeah. When the war kind of shifts to the southern colonies in 1780, the Marylanders are going to be sent down as a part of that. They're going to play a pretty big role at the Battle of Camden.
Okay.
Huge disaster for the Americans.
Yeah.
I mean, Horatio Gates' army ceases to exist. And that's when, we kind of see 7 Maryland regiments formed into one out of the survivors. Like, that's how bad it is.
Is that scene in The Patriot where the like Mel Gibson rolls in on the colonel and they're like, yeah, we last saw Gates riding hard, staff like 12 yards behind him or whatever.
That's
Okay.
exactly it. Yeah, it's an absolute disaster for the Continental Army. One of the few bright spots is the stand. Again, the Marylanders, as kind of the battle-hardened Continentals at this point, they're going to hold the line as the rest of the army crumbles. They're going to take a terrible toll. Like I said, basically after this point, the Maryland line gets reorganized into a much smaller formation because there just aren't that many dudes left.
Oh, would that be like a consolidated unit
exactly.
in the next war?
Yeah.
Yep, they
Sounds
consolidate. That's when Baron de Kalb, I don't know if you guys have been to Annapolis, there's a big statue to Baron de Kalb outside the State House, and that's he was leading the Marylanders in their stand at Camden, and he is wounded like a dozen times.
Yeah.
He's shot multiple times. He's stabbed multiple times.
What, lives?
No.
Okay.
Sorry.
Just the way you said that, I was like, wait a minute.
He lives for a little while. He dies like the next day.
He's got an ironclad named after him later on.
But just for a minute, the way you said that, I was like, wait a minute. That kind of sounds like that dude survived. So
No.
how could you?
But, there's a reason why he's chosen to be honored at the State House is because, he was there leading these Maryland troops. And the Maryland troops that survive that encounter are going to become kind of part of the core of Greene's army when he reforms the Southern Army. You look at a battle like Guilford Courthouse where the bulk of the American troops are militia, North Carolina, Virginia militia. Backstopping those two lines of untrained militia is a small core of very, very experienced Continental troops. And it's going to be the Marylanders, the Delaware guys, some Virginians in there as well, but that's going to be the core of Greene's army, at Guilford Courthouse, the guys that go into battle at Eutaw Springs, Hobkirk's Hill, all these battles in the South.
How is Utah spelled? Is it spelled like Utah the way Orioles fans want it to be spelled?
It sure is. Yeah, EUTAW. Yeah. My wife is from Baltimore, and I'll never forget. We were driving through the city when we were dating, and she was like, "Turn on Utah Street," and I was like,
"What?
I don't see Utah Street." No. But yeah, named after the battle.
Okay. Wait, is that really why the Camden Yard Street is named that?
Yeah.
No,
well, I mean, look at the streets around there. There's like a Guilford Street.
It's
There's
Camden
a Saratoga.
Yards. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Listen, I root for the New York Yankees, all right? When I pay attention to the Baltimore Orioles, it's because A, Cal Ripken was here when I was growing up, and B, it's because they're a division rival who's good again. I don't pay attention. You're an O's fan, aren't you?
Yeah.
I feel like I've seen you recently.
I'll let you guys duke it out.
No,
well, I was
it's
gonna
all
say,
right.
I'm more offended by your Rangers.
There's no
jersey or
duking
whatever.
out.
man,
As
good
we're
man.
recording this, the baseball postseason is happening, and your team is out.
Yep.
And by default, you're a Tigers fan. Actually, they're alive right now. Oh, Matt, I mean, you self-proclaimed not a big sports guy, right?
Right.
When was the last time you watched a Tigers game willingly?
Probably when I went to a game.
Like what? 45 years ago.
I was going to say when I would think 10.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
I don't even know. Cecil Fielders was playing for them.
Right, exactly. And it's like a lot.
It's a
Never
blast
mind.
from the past right there.
There's a whole rant about Detroit teams and having good players holding up those teams that I will not get into right now.
That's true. We'll get to those one day. So, all right. So Maryland has a pretty good reputation, has spread out across the theaters, which was a revelation to me a few years ago when I really first started studying the War for Independence, was that I thought Maryland would kind of be from here and points north. But like just to see them be down there with Green's Army, I was like, oh, we're like all over this war now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things that makes Maryland kind of unique in that situation is, you see Marylanders as far north as Massachusetts,
right?
And you see Marylanders fighting as far south as like Georgia.
Right.
They're involved in every major theater of the war, almost every major battle of the war. There's going to be Marylanders, and like I said, that reputation, especially in the South, when they form this small but so crucial kind of nucleus of trained troops that the militia and the state troops can kind of rally around. It really is what solidifies Maryland's reputation during the war.
So now I want to switch gears a little bit.
Okay.
How are your sea legs?
All right.
So
I'm
obviously,
no Kyle Dalton, but
No, I mean,
good throwback, good reference.
Shout out, Kyle. Nobody's you, buddy. Maryland has, major ports in Annapolis. Baltimore's not the Baltimore we know it as yet, but it's coming up slowly. Is it still
there.
in the den of thieves and piracy era?
Nest of
thieves.
pirates.
Yeah. Okay. But the Chesapeake is a huge critical water source. At one point, I know that we're keeping the British from coming in because we don't want to take them sounding readings, of the bay as they come in, things like that. So how does Maryland navigate this war on the water? Because I know that, again, I'm using the place that I work every day as a good sounding board for a lot of these thoughts because it's one of Maryland's last remaining very, very tangible places to engage with this story. But one of the prisoners at Fort Frederick during the Revolution is Matthew Mangan, who's captain of a privateer ship, a loyalist ship. And he is a devastating force on the Potomac. His little nickname at the time is the Terror of the Chesapeake. So
Nice.
How does Maryland
nickname.
engage? Yeah, especially if you're going to be plundering, right?
Right.
How does Maryland engage with this war in nautical terms, like in the maritime tradition?
Oh, fantastic question. Yeah, I mean, obviously the Chesapeake Bay is the defining geographic feature of Maryland, and one of the colonies in general, the 13 colonies, their biggest shortcoming during the war is their lack of a naval presence. We always kind of throw out there, Britain was the most powerful army on earth. It's not in the 1770s. It's very small by European standards. It's a good army. It's a professional army. But, stack it up against France or Austria or Prussia or whoever. They are absolutely, completely dominant on sea. They have the biggest, most professional, well-trained, experienced Navy in the world. I mean, it makes sense. They're the wooden walls of England. And so one of Britain's biggest advantages during the war is that any place the water touches, they can put troops down.
Right.
Nowhere is safe on the seaboard. And, the Chesapeake Bay becomes a very inviting target. I mean, throwing back to the Brandywine campaign, that campaign kicks off by the British sailing this massive armada from New York Harbor down into the Chesapeake Bay, straight up the Chesapeake Bay, and landing those troops at Head of Elk in northeastern Maryland. There isn't a damn thing the Continental Navy can do to stop this fleet. I mean, there's just not a chance in hell. So what you do see in the Chesapeake is you see this almost kind of like a guerrilla naval war is maybe how I would describe this. The Chesapeake Bay has a million little inlets and islands and places to hide. You've got this incredible population of very experienced watermen who know they know the territory. I was going to say landscape, the waterscape.
That works.
The seascape.
The seascape.
There you go. Yeah.
They know the bay well, and so many of them are going to turn to privateering. You might not see big naval actions, but we're going to see, literally countless small actions. Anyone with anything bigger than a rowboat's going to get out there and take any ship smaller than his. And you're going to see on both sides. You're going to see a lot of loyalist privateers,
Like your guy?
including a lot from Maryland.
And so this loyalist, Matthew Mangan, comes from New York, which makes this even more interesting that he like comes out and targets the Chesapeake. But the reason I also ask is because it seems like when you read the account of his capture that he's captured by basically 2 Patriot privateers.
Yeah.
But it's like, wait a minute, is there anybody official going on here right now? Like everybody's carrying letters of marque.
Right. I mean, the British will send warships into the bay. The Maryland State Navy is active here and there in the bay. The Virginia State Navy is active here and there in the bay. But the bulk of the fighting is going to take place, like I said, between privateers. And, he's a good example. These guys coming down from New York, New Jersey, wherever, and coming into the bay thinking it's going to be easy pickings.
Well, for him, it kind of was. Like when you read about him for a while, you're like, who? I can't even believe they captured him. They took him, Travis, if you're unfamiliar with Matthew Mangan, they took him so seriously. They're sending 5,000 to 6,000 prisoners to the fort over a 3-year period of time, and there's almost no documentation about the particular individuals along the way, except the best stuff we got is about Mangan and his 22 sea robbers, and they're like, they're so freaked out by his, effectiveness at what he's doing that they're like, he's not going to be the guy that if he escapes, he's going to disappear into the wilderness. He's going to cause problems for you. Yeah. So if he gives you trouble, shoot him. It's
really?
Like, wow. It's like, that's so straightforward. Like there's no gray area to it. So, just kind of always been in my mind is like, as much as I'm learning this story of Maryland and the Revolution, I have to remind myself that it's got a equally interesting story, from the sea perspective, how they're navigating this huge...
I like that they dragged him away from the bay as far as possible.
Well, and that's one of the reasons they did it was they didn't want him anywhere near a boat.
Sure.
They're like, dear God.
Yeah, I mean, that's not an uncommon thing. Coming back to what we talked about earlier with the loyalists, I said, one of the big problems for a loyalist is you've got to be able to make it to the British. Well, if you're on the water, that makes it a lot easier. Yeah. And so, especially early in the war, you see a lot of loyalists coming off the eastern shore, and they'll go back, and a lot of these guys will privateer in the bay. Baltimore, even at that early period, is a shipbuilding hub, so ships are going to be constructed there.
Are the British, are they encouraging this for loyalist privateers and whatnot, giving out letters of marque?
Oh, absolutely.
Are they supplying armaments and things like that as well?
Absolutely.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. It's kind of important to remember we're not talking about huge ships here,
Right.
We're not talking about
wee ships.
We're talking like sloops, everywhere. Single-masted ships, maybe.
If that. Yeah. Right. I mean, you're even seeing like row galleys and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, again, the Chesapeake's very shallow. So these little guys in like little sloops and galleys and stuff can pop out, grab a merchantman, disappear very easily. So that's going to go on all the way up to the very end of the war. I mean, you're going to see plenty of little privateer actions, little naval actions throughout the Chesapeake Bay for the entire length of the war.
Wow. Like happening even after the surrender of Cornwallis?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
One of my favorite things, real quick, just to wind down Matthew Mangan here, is at the end of his war experience, so when he's finally let go from Fort Frederick, the first thing he does is file a claim about his ship with the Continental Congress, basically saying you need to pay for it. And I don't have access, so there's University of Maine has apparently some of the original documents from this file or this claim that was made, and so I need to get my hands on them because they're not digitized. But I'm like, did they pay it? Like, I can't imagine they're going to pay that.
You got to admire that.
Oh,
the
huge stones, huge stones. He's like, you know what? You guys suck. I can't believe you caught me, and now you owe me a ship. It's like, damn, dude.
What happens to him?
He just kind of disappears from the record right after that claim. I mean, he, like everybody else, Fort Frederick's prison situation is kind of murky. There's a lot of general records of arrivals, unit arrivals, but it's not like you're getting specific details on who's actually arriving, how many officers, how many enlisted. You're just getting kind of like 400 guys from the 71st Foot. Like you're getting, like, again, hyperbolic number, but you're like getting that. And then right after Washington writes the order in 1781 for 2,400 prisoners from, Cornwallis's surrender, he writes this order, says they're to be imprisoned at Fort Frederick. There are no more records. We don't know if those prisoners arrived, things like that.
Wow.
So, when it comes to what happens to any of the prisoners at Fort Frederick, at a certain point, sometime between 81 and 83, they're all released, and they're either sent up to New York like everybody else is, whatever. But from the time that moment happens till this claim, we don't know. But then he shows up because he files this claim in like December of 1781, and you're like, dude, weak. Like just straight weak. You can't be burning homes along the Chesapeake, and then when you play FAFO, you can't like whine about it. Yeah, they cornered him on the Patuxent, and it took 2 full ships to kind of like pen him in before he finally went down. Yeah, he's kind of got he lives. He's got the Blackbeard story, but he lives. He doesn't get shanked 1,000 times.
Yeah, there's a lot of that stuff going on, especially early in the war in the spring and summer of 1776. Down in Virginia, you've got John Murray, Lord Dunmore, the last royal governor of Virginia. He's been pushed out of his colony, and he's basically living, with his followers and what few troops he has and loyalist civilians on what they refer to as a floating city. We're talking like dozens and dozens of ships of all sizes. And they're going to be cruising around the Chesapeake Bay trying to find places to land, trying to get, reinforcements, food, water, all
Supplies,
that stuff. Disease is running through the fleet, so places where they can rest. And there's a number of occasions where Virginia loyalists are actually caught sailing to the eastern shore and pulling Maryland loyalists off and bringing them to this floating city.
Huh.
Like press gang style?
No, these guys are choosing to.
Okay.
They're kind of refugees, I guess, at this point.
Okay.
Although there is a really cool account that's in some of the colonial records where these guys, they get on board their ship in Baltimore. They're sailors. And once they get out into the bay, the captain's like, haha, psych, we're sailing to Lord Dunmore. You guys are going to join him now. And they are not into this at all. They get there and they get interviewed by Dunmore, and he offers them, like money and uniforms, things like that. And they politely decline, and he actually lets them go, which is the wildest part. But it's this real crazy moment. At one point, Dunmore's fleet sails up the Potomac River and stops basically right off St. Mary's County, in one of the little islands off St. Mary's County, and they're chased off by the Maryland militia.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah, they land there to try and get water and things like that, and they just
said nope.
Yep. They said no. And that's the last time Dunmore sets foot in the colonies. I mean,
Is it really?
His fleet leaves the Chesapeake Bay in August of 1776, and they don't come back.
Get the hell out of here.
Yeah.
Wow.
Goodbye.
So I mean, this kind of small scale naval fighting is it's all over the place.
That's
the
awesome.
Entire period.
Navy things, Matt?
Yeah, Navy things.
Navy things. Navy things are awesome. Love Navy things. All right, so Maryland has spread itself over the entire theaters of war. It has done its it's as good a work as it can do. Managing its own waterways. Seems like it was pretty effective and at times completely ineffective. I mean, what are you going to do when the Royal Navy's doing its thing,
shows
right?
up? Yeah,
but in 1781, Cornwallis surrenders, and the major hostilities basically instantly end or very quickly start to wind down. Maryland at that point is, like everybody, kind of navigating a lot of things. So I want you to kind of sort of take us through how it goes through things like the surrender and things like the Confiscation Act, because when I said I had another question for you, it ties into that. How does Maryland start to navigate the winding down of its role in the War for Independence?
So one of the biggest roles Maryland's going to play in that, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, Maryland troops are at the Siege of Yorktown.
Oh, hell yeah.
There are Marylanders there.
Hell yeah.
Nice.
But one of the big things is the role of prisoners. And I know you've been waiting to talk about this. We've kind of brought it up a few times, but Maryland is going to become kind of a staging area for prisoners because it's never really directly in the line of battle in the sense that, like, New Jersey or North Carolina or Virginia, all these places where the armies are fighting.
Sure.
Right.
Maryland's kind of a safe place. It's out of the way. So right from the get-go, we're going to have tons of prisoners of war either moving through Maryland or being, imprisoned in Maryland.
Other than just at places like Fort Frederick or the barracks in...
I was going to say, you got to mention the barracks.
Got to mention the barracks.
But like other than those two, what are some notable places of imprisonment
mean,
around the colony becoming a state?
One of the coolest stories is right in downtown Frederick on 2nd Street. There's a little spot. There's a plaque on the side of the building.
Tory jail?
Tory jail, yes. Yeah.
I have seen that plaque.
And that was constructed during the war, and they hold, as the name suggests, Loyalist prisoners there.
That's not the original building, right?
No,
Okay.
no. The original building was a log building that's long gone.
Long gone.
Long gone. But they're holding Loyalist prisoners there beginning in like 1776. And that becomes, there's not enough room there, so they start holding a lot of prisoners in the county jail that was over by the old courthouse. There aren't enough, there's not enough room there to hold these guys, and that's when they convert the barracks, the Hessian barracks, into a POW camp. But that's going to be used throughout the war. You got guys that were captured at Saratoga, the Convention Army. The idea is that, initially they were held in Boston, then they said, we got to get these guys away from the coast.
Yeah, we got to move them.
Right. So they move them down to the backcountry. The idea is to move them into the Shenandoah Valley, and they keep them briefly in Maryland on the way, and then you've got the Yorktown prisoners. That's a huge part of the story. And one of the major roles of the Maryland militia, a lot of the militia pensions that we read about are guys that guarded prisoners as they were being marched up from Yorktown. They're going to split those prisoners into two big groups. Half of them are going to be marched west out to Winchester. And then the other half is going to be marched to Fort Frederick.
Right.
And eventually, the following spring of 1782, those prisoners who were held at Winchester are actually brought up through Maryland as well.
Did they come to Fort Frederick? Because that's a question we're wondering, because it's like direct, like the roads through that area, that would make sense, but it's like the fort is already so overburdened. It's like, would that have even been something they considered?
I don't believe they did.
Right.
And one of the reasons I don't think so is we have a diary of one of the prisoners.
Okay.
There's a guy, Conrad Doles, from a Bayreuth regiment, so German soldier. And he talks about what it's like. He talks about like crossing the river at Shepherdstown and into Maryland and stuff like that. And, they go to Frederick.
Right.
Which makes sense because the British Commissioner of Prisoners, and I'm going to look over my shoulder at Ian.
Oh, yeah. We can do this.
Sorry.
We can give a shout out to Ian.
James Gordon, my man. Thank you. Of the 80th Regiment, correct? Yeah. James Gordon of the 80th Regiment, the Royal Edinburgh Volunteers.
Nice.
He's kind of overseeing the British prisoners in the area, and he's operating out of Frederick. So he's in contact with, his counterpart Moses Rawlings, as well as his counterparts in Virginia and stuff, kind of looking over the well-being of these prisoners.
One of the confusing things we're finding is when people are mentioning Frederick, it's like, are they mentioning Fort Frederick or the prison at Frederick? Like, which prison are you talking about?
Right. Which one of the three jails in Frederick are we talking about?
Right.
Yeah, it's incredibly confusing. But yeah, Fort Frederick has a cool story because, of course, it's a French and Indian War fort,
right?
Defensive work, but by the time of the Revolution, there's no threat coming from that part of the world. So what do you do with it? You fill it full of
You put
prisoners.
a bunch of dirty redcoats in it.
Yeah.
You say, how do you like that? You think about that. What was interesting was, and I got to give a shout out to one of our interpreters, or I guess now one of our former interpreters, Jacob Davis, who was doing some real deep diving on this subject this summer and came across some records that spell it out pretty plainly that the miserable experience that a lot of these POWs are having at Fort Frederick is an on-purpose experience. So the context of like why things are falling apart, why is there so little food, and all that has been largely kind of confusing and or at times misleading. But he found some documentation that looks at Fort Frederick's sort of experience as one of the answers to how Americans are being held in the aftermath of the local paroles being kind of shut down, right? At one point in time earlier in the war, the local commands are, the prisoners are a burden to you, right? Like you have to feed them, you have to kind of take care of them. Right. So paroling is happening more frequently. And then at a certain point, King George and the Britons say, stop that. You're recognizing their sovereignty. Doesn't say it that plainly, but that's really when the prison ships and like the lower Manhattan prison, like they all kind of like ramp up to like the steroid era, where they're just kind of like overdrive. And it looks like Fort Frederick is kind of being used as this intentional close confinement. Like, we're going to put too many people in this space so that they can kind of understand this. It's not okay. Do you see that happening in any of the jails in Frederick where they're just being like packed beyond capacities?
Absolutely. I mean, the particularly the county jail.
Right.
You see it pop up again and again in accounts that like it's overcrowded to the point where, it's unhealthy, it's unsanitary. These guys are in really bad shape. You see the same with the Tory jail, and there's just the few documents we have about the Tory jail. There's kind of, again, this inference that like these guys are loyalists. They deserve it.
Right.
And as loyalists, they wouldn't, if they're not serving in the British Army, they're not necessarily afforded the same kind of rights as a British prisoner of war would.
Right.
If you're a British soldier and you're captured, you're a prisoner of war, like the British government effectively pays for you to be fed and stuff like that. At least in theory,
Right.
a lot of that money goes missing.
Yeah,
or,
goes
like
towards other things,
other
like
things.
food for us.
But there's a lot of overcrowding in all of the places in Frederick in particular. And Fort Frederick, I mean, those guys are living out in tents.
Right.
They're in kind
terrible Valley Forge style huts, and the barracks are overflowing. And
right, yeah, these guys aren't in solid buildings. They're basically living out under the stars.
We're like, look, and we hate to do the direct, this to this, but like if you want to see what this looked like, Andersonville photographs are a pretty good idea of what it looks like inside the fort, minus the atmospheric, like why is this happening and things like that. But like just visually, when you see there's so many people in this very small space, that's as close as you're going to get.
I was going to say something
experience.
Similar to that. Obviously the death is nowhere near on the scale.
Correct.
Like, could never even approach
no,
Andersonville or
no,
Elmira or any of those.
No.
But visually, absolutely,
Yeah.
we're talking about guys that are living out in like shanties.
Yeah.
Yeah. And like you said, how many thousands of prisoners are held at Fort Frederick?
Yeah, like
during the
5 to 6 over 3 years. You're like,
Wow.
what?
Yeah.
Like the fort was only built for 200 people.
Yeah.
You're like, holy smokes. Yeah, I think we have to be very careful with that. So if you've either seen me at my site or you're listening now, like that's 5 to 6 over 3 years. And I think the most that we can definitively put in the fort at one time is like 1,200.
Which is still
That's
a
1,000
lot of
more than
crazy
capacity.
number of men. I
yeah,
mean,
that's
yeah.
ridiculous. So the British Confiscation Act is something I want to talk about for a bit because it's, in some personal research and some professional research, I found that this Confiscation Act has shown up in fun ways. And I'll lead it off with my question to you. Actually, first, can you tell our listeners just what the British Confiscation Act is?
Good idea.
So, we've talked a lot about loyalists and people who supported the crown. One of the things that will happen to many of these people is their property will be confiscated by the various colonial governments, not only as a punishment, but as a way of kind of funding the war effort. We're extremely cash poor. We can't get any of our goods traded out of any ports because the Royal Navy's there.
Right.
So, like, how do we raise funds? Well, a good way to do that is to take land from people you don't like. I actually have a personal connection to this. One of my ancestors in Connecticut had his land confiscated by the Connecticut Committee of Safety, and had to flee. That's how part of my family went to Canada.
Nice. Like, I got no beef with Canada, all right?
No, but it's incredibly common, and every colony kind of has their own version of this, and it's going to become very important in Maryland because we talked about some of those families earlier, these big, massive landowning plantation families. The ones that pick the wrong side, they're going to have their land taken away. The Delaney's.
Well, let's talk about the Devil Bisses specifically because they're up between Walkers. If you don't know them personally, that's fine. But the reason
I know Devil Biss Bridge Road,
and all that stuff.
Yeah, knew a bunch of them growing up. But
I was going to ask, do you know much? And if the answer is no, that's fine. But what I found and why this is coming up now as a question I'm kind of asking is, so when I was researching, and again, tying all these threads into one thing, I was last winter researching a bread baker at Fort Frederick during the French and Indian War period. And come to find out he's part of that huge migratory path you were talking about of German immigrants and Scottish and Irish immigrants, right? So kind of tying into that. But he's got a son who is relevant to both of our 18th century stories. So we're doing the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon thing here. But eventually I end up on this moment in 1781 where Moses Rawlings purchases the Devil Biss property, never lives on it, but ends up owning it in 1781, which is all the way out by, like where you grew up, where I'm living now, things like that. And I just was wondering if you had any knowledge of their operations as loyalists, because
I had
Delaney,
no idea. Wow.
Delaney, right, at one point owns like all or most of Frederick County,
Right.
starts to parcel all of it off. And Delaney's lot was that, or I guess Monocacy Manor was that massive 10,000 acre tract of land that makes up essentially Walkersville and Woodsboro.
Kriegerstown, that whole area.
Kriegerstown, yeah. And
Yep.
the Devil Bisses are a huge family at that time. And I'm like, just wondering if you knew anything about them, particularly as loyalists.
Not in particular. Most of my studies into loyalists kind of comes out of this, but in a really roundabout way. Many of the loyalists who left were able to file claims with the British government. You could basically say, I lost my farm, I lost 3 horses, I lost 10 cows, whatever it is, I lost my ship, whatever, and file this claim with the British in the hopes that you would be, compensated. Yeah. So the Loyalist claims records are a really fascinating resource, but the problem with them is that it's only a small sliver of Loyalists who actually file them. I mean, we've got some great ones for people in Maryland and Virginia and so forth that give a lot of kind of personal detail. They really kind of humanize the story of what these people went through. But I never come across the Devil Vistas in that, and I don't think...
Just something that popped up. I knew that you were local to the area, so I figured I'd ask. Another question.
That's a new one for me. I'm gonna.
Yeah, Colonel Moses Rawlings
really cool.
ends up purchasing their property during one of the Confiscation Act's auctions, and I was like, "Whoa!" I was like, "There's a million things out there."
A lot of these properties end up getting sold to the people who are kind of movers and shakers in the American cause. A lot of officers and politicians and stuff will end up buying these.
Oh, and he buys multiple. It's not just their property. Like in that one auction, he ends up, I think, with 4 different properties, and he never lives on them because he goes west after the war, and I think is buried in Cumberland today.
Yep.
But so there was that, and then another person local to sort of my professional world that I kind of want to explore this moment with is Governor Horatio Sharp, who obviously is the governor of the colony of Maryland at the time they built Fort Frederick. He's obviously not in office anymore by the time of the Revolution, and has in fact headed back to London, I think in 1773. Not related. He's going home to take care of family stuff, but all of his property is seized in this Confiscation Act. And then at one point, Maryland is like trying to get him to come back and like reclaim it. Is it like a trick? Like, are they trying to like come back? Like why? So like, why are they Why are they inviting him back? Or is that something you're familiar with?
I can't say I'm familiar with that.
They do. They're like, come on back, and he's like, no. The Rideout family will maintain that forever.
Interesting.
Yeah,
that's wild.
Who knows, man? Like this.
I mean, you do see some loyalist families come back. I mean, it's important to remember for a lot of these loyalists, America is their
only life.
They've been here for generations, just as long as everyone else. So, going back to England, they're not from England. So you do see that occasionally. I'm more familiar with a few cases down in Virginia. One in particular, Thomas Taylor Bird of the Birds of Virginia. He actually sides with the British. He leads African American troops, Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment, this regiment of freed slaves. After the war, he goes to England for a few years, but ends up coming back to America and reclaiming property that was owned by his mom's family out in the Shenandoah Valley, and dies out near Berryville. It does happen. You do occasionally see that. I think a lot of that has to do with how far up the social ladder you
that's
are.
where I was gonna go with that, because I'm curious how the social hierarchy in the colonies, and they're well-to-do in Maryland, Virginia, where else, but then they get pulled out, or they flee, and now they're in England, the heart of the empire. How is that social status going to look compared to the folks that are actually there?
Yeah, you're American rich, you're not British rich.
Right, that sort of thing.
Well, in some cases, American rich was richer
Better?
than British rich. I mean, the
true.
Carters of the Birds, they're
true.
on par with almost anyone in Britain.
Okay.
I mean, it's going to depend.
But there's different social mores and the way to
absolutely.
run society, things like that.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the big reasons why you don't see a lot of loyalists going to England. If loyalists choose to leave, the vast majority go to Canada,
Right.
and basically restart exactly what they were doing in America, just in a different colony. In the South, you'll see a lot of loyalist planters go to the Bahamas, go to Bermuda, go to Florida, which at the time was
Spanish
British colony.
Oh, it was. I'm sorry.
It was, and then Britain gives it back to Spain at the end of the Revolution. So there's briefly a few years where these loyalists, like after 81, show up, and then in 83 have to leave.
Do they leave again? Really?
Many of them do. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And that's a whole nother crazy story. Gotta keep like I
Well,
should be
it's okay.
keeping a list of like topics to talk about.
I got a couple tangential questions for you. So,
But yeah, one of the most heartbreaking loyalist claims I've ever read is actually of an African American man who he's maimed during the war and ends up in England. And when he files his claim, he's like a beggar on the streets of London.
oh, that's hard.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's one extreme.
Yeah.
The other extreme is kind of these people like the Birds who are able to just kind of come back and like end up being massive plantation owners in Virginia all over again. Yeah.
So what happens to the Delaney's, since they're kind of a big name that, was branded loyalists mainly because they weren't maybe into the fight, but the gripes they kind of were in line with?
Yeah, there's actually a split in the family. Daniel Delaney the younger, kind of the loyalist Delaney as we kind of know him,
Right.
he gets his land confiscated. He kind of dies, I mean, not in poverty, that would be really misstating it, but dies
not well off.
Not well off. I mean, he's kind of almost in exile in his own country,
I see.
if that makes sense. Like he's not.
Is he still in Frederick County or around
He's still
Frederick County?
he's still in the colonies,
But he's being ostracized.
He's being ostracized. He's lost his social standing. He's lost his property. There are other Delaneys who actually side with the revolutionary cause. There's I forget his name. The one that ends up going to Virginia after the war. He serves on Washington's staff for a while.
Oh wow!
So there's a split in the family, kind of a generational split. And again, I feel so stupid that I can't remember his first name, but and that's again not uncommon. You see generational splits within families, and I mean I think that kind of speaks to kind of more conservative versus more radical, depending on what age we're at. But yeah, the Delaneys, kind of the political and economic power of the Delaneys here in Maryland is broken by the Revolution for the most part.
All right. Next name I want to ask you about, John Dagworthy. Do you know anything about him?
You've talked about him before.
Well, because he's one of the 5 provincial captains of the Maryland forces during the French and Indian War, but he becomes a general by the time of the Revolution. Do we know anything about him?
No, I mean, this is...
All right, add it to the list.
You're throwing French and Indian War stuff at me.
I'm just looking for these things that connect, because a lot of these guys that have this, very prominent place in one story are involved in the second story. Like out of the 5 company commanders, 4 are Patriot. We have 1 loyalist. Richard Paris runs down and raises a mixed Cherokee force in South Carolina. So these guys are involved in both these stories. So I'd just like to ask, especially since we're focusing on Maryland, he's probably one of the bigger names. The other thing I want to ask about is the Gist family. The reason for that is Washington and obviously Christopher Gist have a very, tied together relationship. Their legacies, especially in the 1750s, are, wrapped around each other. Mordecai Gist is a general in Washington's army. Joshua Gist is buried only about 10 driving minutes from where we're sitting right now, and he's a colonel in the militia, so he stays within the state here. So the Gists, the Washingtons, they are familiar with each other. The Gists obviously are kind of spread across several colonies, but what do we know about the Gists in Maryland during the Revolution?
So earlier I mentioned kind of that reformation of the Continental Army in 1777, and as I said, every colony is responsible for a regiment, and then there's additional regiments. One of those is Gist's additional regiment.
Okay.
So these are officers that are kind of handpicked by Washington to command these regiments, and Gist is going to be mostly men from Maryland and Virginia. They're going to serve with the Continental Army through most of the war.
Is Gist picked because his last name is Gist, and he kind of is aware of that family's quality?
Yeah, exactly. Washington... When you look at especially in Virginia regiments, but also in some Maryland regiments, you see a lot of personal connections.
Sure.
Washington knows these people either through his surveying business or his political career. So yeah, no doubt he was picked because of his connection to Washington. And that's actually kind of a good segue to something that I wanted to touch on before, but the reputation of not just Maryland soldiers, but Maryland officers. Because there are so many of these guys that become household names by the end of the war. I mean, not only do you have Smallwood, who commands the Marylanders in New York, but you've got John Edgar Howard, namesake of Howard County here in Maryland.
Yep.
You've got Otho Williams, big Williamsport family.
Yep.
You've got all these Moses Rawling, all these kind of planters turned officers turned politicians. Many of these men are going to be governors of Maryland after the war, play a role in the kind of early federal history of Maryland. And these are guys that for the most part have tremendous reputations as fighting officers. Especially as I said, those guys that kind of rose to prominence in the South.
I wonder if one, as you're saying that, I'm wondering if Mordecai Gist is buried in, I want to say, the churchyard at St. Michael's down in Charleston, South Carolina. And I'm wondering if he's there because did he serve with the Marylanders that went down there? Like, how does he end up there? Is there a connection, or is my brain just being whack? It's probably just being whack.
No, I mean,
there's definitely Gist in South Carolina because we see them a century later.
Oh yeah, and we see them in
states'
Tennessee.
rights,
Yeah. We'll do a whole episode on how they just pick names.
Yeah.
Like, there's like Federal Ann.
Right.
It's like, bro, what are you doing? All right. So Maryland has kind of navigated the winding down of hostilities. By the time the Treaty of Paris is signed in 1783, is it for it's Paris or Versailles? I always get
Paris.
these confused because
Paris.
there's 1,000 treaties of each.
if it's not Paris, it's Versailles.
That's right, that's
But,
why-
it's a good guess. It's
Yeah.
one or the other.
That's
right?
a
Paris.
50-50 shot
Yeah,
getting
no,
that one.
Treaty of Paris, yeah.
Ghent, I can remember because that's the outlier, and that's the Second War with England.
Right.
So when the Treaty of Paris is signed, obviously Maryland doesn't become a state for another 5 years. But how does Maryland navigate this moment where independence is officially recognized, the war is outright over? Is it still dealing with like the slow news? Is there still like hostilities that kind of occur? Like, just how does Maryland navigate that moment when it's the ink's on the paper now?
Once the ink's on the paper, Maryland's pretty well
Just like we're
situated.
out, we're
I
done.
mean, again, one of the big benefits that Maryland has versus her neighbors is that the war didn't directly touch it.
Right.
That's a good point.
So, Maryland farms have not been burned. Maryland, homes have not been burned. Maryland.
Has its maritime taken a hit, though, because of all of the privateering and piracy and so forth and so on?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. But not enough to really kind of cripple the economy.
Oh, that's good.
As far as I know, again, I'm not Kyle. I'm not a maritime historian by trade, but as far as I know, Maryland comes out of the Revolution fairly well off. One of the few things that really works against it is as I mentioned earlier, Maryland's cut off from the western frontier very early on. So while, colonies like Pennsylvania or Virginia have these massive reserves of land that they can sell off to raise money, to cover debts and things like that, Maryland does not have that option.
Maryland is just what it is.
It is what it is. Although that far western part of Maryland, kind of out Garrett County, Allegheny County, a lot of that was reserved as lots for soldiers who served in the Army. So much like other colonies, they're not just paying these guys, but they're paying them in land.
Sometimes I wonder out loud, Travis, if we're still holding that part of Maryland as in case we got to pay off any of the surrounding states. It's just like, do we give you Garrett County?
I mean,
Maybe. Who wants it? And you know what's weird? The states surrounding it are like, I don't want it. You can keep it.
There's some nice little towns out there.
Aren't some of those counties trying to join West Virginia? Like
Yeah.
Allegheny?
No, yeah, no. Let it happen.
I can't say too much. My in-laws live in Garrett counties.
Yeah, no.
It's
be
beautiful
safe.
out there.
It is.
It's
It's
nice.
gorgeous.
Yeah.
It is beautiful out there.
But I mean, that's the extent of Maryland's quote unquote frontier at the end of the war.
Yeah,
So there's not the opportunities that say, Virginia has or New York has, where there's vast tracts of land that they can use to raise funds very quickly.
All of Ohio.
Yeah. You can just sell off Ohio and
Exactly.
So here's sort of my last sort of related, unrelated question. Does Maryland have to navigate any additional variables to the war? Obviously, we've talked about how it relates to land fighting, how it relates to sea fighting, but in other places, especially when you get south in the southern colonies of fighting, there's these, native components, right? I alluded to Richard Paris being one of the company commanders at Fort Frederick. He's later a loyalist. He's got a mixed company at Cherokee. Do we in Maryland encounter any sort of the indigenous peoples in fighting, in trade, or is that story kind of just done as far as the colony of Maryland is concerned?
So it's for all intents and purposes done.
Right.
I mean, by the time the Revolution rolls around, Maryland is pretty we're a few generations beyond being the frontier.
Yeah.
There is a serious scare that happens very early in the war. This is a fun story that kind of relates to a bunch of the topics we've talked about. There's a guy up in Fort Pitt named John Connolly, and Connolly is been an associate of Lord Dunmore's. He's kind of this frontier wheeler dealer speculator type, and he is traveling through Maryland. He's out near Hagerstown or Sharpsburg, kind of that area, and he gets picked up by local militia carrying papers purportedly from Lord Dunmore giving him a commission to raise troops. Not just raise troops, but natives out at Fort Pitt.
Wow.
And the idea is like these guys are going to attack Virginia and Maryland from the west while Dunmore and his fleet are attacking from the bay. And there's this moment of absolute panic where it's still early on enough in the war. Like, is this a real thing? Is this a real threat? Could this actually happen? Sure. I mean, looking back on it, it seems pretty far-fetched that this guy's going to lead an army of natives from Pittsburgh to invade Maryland. But, you know, at the time, it was a terrifying prospect. And so he's brought to jail. He's one of the first people incarcerated at the Tory jail in Frederick. Connolly's going to spend most of the war, you know, under arrest. That's not the last time that happens in Maryland. This is a story that I'd feel really terrible if I forgot to talk about. But in 1781, there's another huge panic that occurs.
Relative to natives or just in general?
Relative to loyalists in
Okay.
particular in this case, where, you know, you've got a British army operating not too far away in Virginia. And you have this kind of secret group of local loyalists who are conspiring, at least, you know, supposedly conspiring to enlist men to help bust the prisoners out of Fort Frederick and out of the Hessian barracks and go and join Cornwallis's army. You know, theoretically bringing thousands of men to Cornwallis. This kind of the ringleaders of this group are in Frederick and Washington counties. They're kind of infiltrated by the local militia. They're arrested. According to one of them, they're like supposedly they had signed up like 600 men to go join Cornwallis. Like that's probably
but
not
An
true.
exaggeration, but still.
But when that hits the papers or, you know, people hear about this, that's terrifying. And so the 6 ringleaders of this plot are actually put on trial and found guilty, and they are sentenced to be hung, drawn, and quartered.
Damn.
So I've heard a variation of this story, and supposedly some of that did occur here in Frederick.
They were put on trial in Frederick. They were sentenced to die. We know that some of them were executed. This is the weirdest part of the story is we can't say for certain whether they were actually hung, drawn, and quartered. The kind of legend or you know, the story has always been that maybe they did it to the first guy and then everybody was like, all right, that's a bit much. Maybe just hang the other guys.
Yeah.
So that's what, did they hang him? Did they shoot him?
So at least 2 of them were actually sent to be impressed into the French Navy.
Wow.
Yeah, the French Navy sitting in the Chesapeake. This is like Yorktown-ish era, and these guys end up being like, essentially they're supposed to be sent to the Mediterranean to be like galley slaves. For the French Navy. At least I think one of them escapes while he's with the French Navy. So I mean, it's like this really crazy story. One of the ones executed is a guy named Caspar Fritchie, who is Barbara Fritchie's father-in-law,
Right.
which is like a weird Civil War connection, Frederick history connection. Unrelated to that, but another great connection. I mentioned Konrad Dola earlier, this German who's brought through Frederick. One of the guys that's in his regiment that deserts in Frederick, as so many German soldiers do, is a guy named Konrad Engelbrecht.
Oh, wow.
Jacob Engelbrecht's
Nice.
father, yes.
That's
father
awesome.
of the diarist.
Did he keep a diary too?
Unfortunately not. God, I wish he did. But one cool thing that we've been able to do is me and my friend Ian, who's sitting behind me.
Yeah, shout out again, Ian.
Hey,
We'll let you say hey in a minute here, bud.
Ian's the expert on prisoner of war stuff, actually. You should get him on here for that.
Right on.
He's also an expert in Scottish military history. So,
which fascinates me.
Yeah.
So,
if you want to know about Highland regiments during the Revolution,
which I do.
So one thing that Ian and I did was we sat down with Dola's diary and we found the names of the guys that deserted in Frederick. And then we sat down with Jacob Engelbrecht's diary, written decades later, and he lists whenever Revolutionary War veterans in town die. And we've been able to match up a few of the names.
That's
awesome.
Yeah. So cool.
That is
again,
very cool.
Once again, nailing down. Thank God for Jacob Engelbrecht. He would have been the worst neighbor.
Oh, yeah.
Like, God, he would have been so annoying.
And now I shall teach my son Jacob to keep an eye on everyone.
Yeah, like that's literally it. No,
I mean, yeah, pretty much. But I mean, it just goes to show that like there's all these great connections. You know, we started this out by talking about, people don't really think about Maryland and the Revolution or how it affected Maryland. And here we are seeing kind of echoes of it a generation or 2 generations, 3 generations later with the Civil War generation.
Yeah.
We like to talk about the War of 1812 when we fight the British because they do a whole lot of that right here.
Hell yeah.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't always go well. Like, but like,
no, but it
doesn't always go well.
I'm a big War of 1812 guy because I'm a big Napoleonic guy.
Yeah.
Right on.
The War of 1812 is just the Napoleonic War in America.
Yeah,
That's cool. And especially the naval stuff. I mean, it's hard not to get into
Hell yeah.
that. But yeah,
but Bladensburg sucked.
Bladensburg sucked.
I mean, North Point sucked. I mean, North Point is like the monocacy of the 1812. It's like, how can we be a speed bump? Like, it's technically a battlefield loss, but Baltimore did not get grabbed.
Right.
Like, that's a win, baby. Anyway, we'll come to that.
Like the Marylanders at New York.
That's true,
they
Matt.
were
Have we
speed
ever
bump.
covered 1812 on this show? I don't think
I was
we
trying
have.
to think about it.
Have we done like, I know it's been mentioned once, but like, has it been an episode?
We've had Trousseau on, but no, I don't think we've actually covered War of 1812 yet. So that's going to have to be a priority.
All right,
soon.
maybe you come back and talk 1812. Maybe we'll run it back with the British, and then we'll run it back with Travis. We've been shouting out your buddy here a couple times. Ian, come get on mic real fast. Come say hey to our listeners, and just like introduce yourself.
I'll hand it over.
Yeah, let's do that. This is the first time we've ever done this. Ian's been hanging out in studio. This is Ian McDougall. I get your name right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Scottish people have interesting pronounced last names. You never know. Ian, thanks for joining us here on the show, bud. When we have you on, tell our listeners a little bit about you, and then I guess, like, do you have anything to add to our conversation? You said you know a lot about prison stuff. Do you know anything about Fort Frederick? I don't know, which is probably everything, because I don't know a lot.
I mean, I know it's, as you've said, it's an abysmal existence.
Yeah.
Just that they split pretty much everyone up between the camp at Winchester and at Fort Frederick. And
do you have any insight to the Germans' troops? Because one of the things we don't know is, do the Hessians that are with that 2,400 arrive with them, or do they get split off and sent directly to Frederick because Frederick speaks German?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I know that the Germans specifically that get sent to Winchester don't stay there very long.
Okay.
And it's been my understanding that they go to Frederick, Maryland. Conrad Dola's diary that Travis mentioned earlier takes pretty much all of them from Winchester into Frederick, Maryland, I think around January, February of '82. So I don't know that they I don't know how many
time to be in
actually,
Frederick.
Yeah, I don't know how many actually go out to Fort Frederick. My understanding is mostly the English troops.
That's what I would understand too, but
Yeah.
it's just one of those we don't have a definitive answer.
Right.
By the way, I just realized, for billing ourselves as the world heavyweight champs of historical podcasting, I just realized we watched our first tag-in happen there.
That's true.
So you guys would then become by default the tag team champs of historical podcasting.
The Virginia Piedmont Heritage Area,
That's right. That's right. Well, that's why when you were like, I hope that's cool, I'm like, of course it's cool.
No, it's been a lot of fun just being a fly on the wall. This is a really, really cool
You're
podcast.
our live studio audience.
That's right.
And a participant.
So when formal invitation, please come on the show. What are we going to talk about with you? What is your jam?
Yeah, well, my background is Virginia in the American Revolution.
All right.
Travis is kind of the Maryland guy. I
Respect, Travis. Respect.
but definitely kind of what's going on in the Northern Virginia Piedmont and that crossover into Maryland a little bit too there. POWs is my jam. I love talking, throughout the American Revolution. These vital roads, especially this network that comes down from like York and Lancaster, Pennsylvania through Frederick, and then south into, say, Leesburg and all the way down into the Carolinas, is such an incredible road and network, as you've got war being fought off in the frontier in the west, and you've got this war being fought in the east along the coastal cities. This road becomes so much more important as trade can't really travel very much up the coast.
Right.
Everything's going up there. Troops, supplies, prisoners. And so that's all really my.
So
jam.
we're
I
having
love
Ian
it.
back to talk about this.
Definitely.
We definitely have to do
Definitely.
that.
I
would
love
love to.
that passion. I love that
would love
energy.
to.
Oh, that's fantastic. All right, well, let's get Travis back on here. We're going to go ahead and wind things down. That was Ian McDougall, public historian, absolute badass, great set of hair, great head of hair there, buddy, by the way. I just have to comment on everybody who's got better hair than me, which is quite literally everybody.
It's because you don't have anybody.
You do Newville too, right, Ian? Yeah, you're British, though. Okay.
Right on.
So everybody at this table's French, you know. We know what's up. We know what's up. Actually, I got to throw a little shade. Last November when we were all up there together, you guys kept letting the Germans in through your line. What was going on there?
I can't.
I got hit by a flamethrower twice because they came through the 18th line. I'm like, come on, guys, can you stop a German?
I can't take any blame. I was doing stretcher bearer, so I wasn't even on the line.
Oh, there you go.
I was
Okay.
hanging out in the back drinking wine.
That was the right answer.
That is the correct answer.
Yeah, we kept sitting there. We're like, they keep running over their line, and every time we turn around, there's this dude with the flamethrower. I'm like, well, that sucks.
I was like hanging out with the nurses drinking wine. So.
Oh, dude, you had a way better time than we did.
That's a great enlistment.
Yeah, we should join that unit. Anyway, to wind down this conversation then, so Maryland plays a very unique role, very critical role, but not a very big and publicly sexy role at all times. Fair way to describe Maryland in the Revolution. How would you do that?
I mean, I think part of it is just a kind of a symptom of how we talk about military history. If there isn't a battle here, then we kind of just ignore it completely.
Oh, tell me about it. That's the story of the fort.
Right. You've got this incredible military site, but nobody really
attacked it. So they're like, oh, that's cool.
And yeah, I think that's one of the things that kind of doesn't play to Maryland's favor is because we don't have that physical battlefield reminder here. You know, not like the War of 1812. We can go to North Point. We can go to Bladensburg. We can go to Fort McHenry.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, that's huge. Nothing like that exists for
Second
the Rev War
coolest
for us.
fort in Maryland. Second coolest fort.
Nicely
shame.
done.
No
Nicely
shame.
done.
But, you know, so it really then becomes taking the story beyond Maryland and talking about what Marylanders do. And I think that story has been recognized in a lot of ways. You know, there's a very popular history book about Washington's Immortals.
Right.
There's been a lot of studies, you know, wonderful studies of some of the Southern battles by Larry Babbitts, you know, about Guilford Courthouse and Cowpens, talking about the role of Marylanders down there. I think one of the big challenges moving forward as we get into the 250th, and I've talked to some of the folks that are on Maryland's 250 committee and things like that, is taking it beyond the military context, you know.
Yes.
Not just talking about the soldiers, but talking about how people are getting by here in Maryland. Not just talking about the politics, but talking about the everyday history. So a lot of the stuff that I think we touched on plays into that. You know, we talked, you know, Ian was just talking about all the supplies that are coming out here. Like we need to start looking at like Maryland farms and what they're producing and for the Army. I think we need to start looking at, you know, the kind of political movements that are going on in Maryland during the Revolution, kind of further exploring that theme of how do we get from subject to citizen.
Yeah.
And what that means for the people who aren't the ones sitting in Annapolis writing the laws. I think that's really where the next step is going to be. And I think, you know,
I think you just had a great program title right there, Subject to Citizen.
Man, that sounds actually done.
Doesn't it?
That's
Yeah.
great.
Is that not already? Is that not already?
Trademark.
Yeah.
Trademark, feed my heritage.
No, I mean, I think this is a great opportunity to start answering these questions in more depth because there is going to be a spotlight on this period.
Yeah.
And I think there's going to be a lot of great scholarship and hopefully some public interest. Hopefully we can bring interest to the public.
So let me ask you about
absolutely.
that. So are you organizing any public programming that you want to shout out or talk about or publicize yet?
So as in my professional capacity, absolutely. So Virginia Piedmont Heritage Area, we're 5-county heritage area in Northern Virginia, just across the river, you know, Loudoun County and so forth. We do a full calendar of public programs throughout the year that touch on local history. I know Ian actually just put a program up on our website that's commemoration of Lafayette's visit.
Oh,
Right
cool.
on, yeah.
You know, we're in the 200th of that now. And so we have author Mark Leipson is going to be talking about his biography of Lafayette that he wrote.
Oh, I just realized this is his 200th anniversary of his Show Me Some Love visit.
His visit, yeah.
Yeah, there's a gentleman actually kind of recreating his tour back through.
Because in Frederick, we have part of that because he shows up.
Correct.
And I think, doesn't he help like the Jug Bridge? Isn't he there for like the
He's there
unveiling or whatever?
He stays over by the courthouse. There's a house there that he stays in. Yeah, I mean,
you're welcome.
Where didn't he go?
It's like it's his "You're Welcome" tour.
Yeah. I mean, just
it is.
people always ask like if I could be president at any moment in history, what would it be? Lafayette's return tour would have to be pretty high up on that list because it's like a 13-month-long party.
Yeah.
In every state in the country.
Huh. That's what I mean. It's like he just goes everywhere and it's like, "You're welcome," and they're like, "Oh my God!"
Yeah. But yeah, he spends several days down near Leesburg because that's where James Monroe is living.
Right.
He comes out with John Quincy Adams. They have a big to-do. So next year we've got a bunch of cool living history programs set up for that. We're going to do like a Historians on Tap bar crawl.
Right on.
We're going to do some other cool public programming. So trying to think of what else. We just finished our big Civil War conference, but we've always got things going on. If you go to PiedmontHeritage.org, you'll see some of the events that we've got going on. And I'll take any opportunity to come up across the river back to Maryland too. So
of course.
Well, you guys run a great operation down there. I had the pleasure of speaking at the conference a few years ago.
Oh, right.
And so it's a wonderful organization. They have some great public programming. I highly suggest anybody who's interested in Civil War topics, Revolutionary War topics, the Piedmont itself, go down there and check them out.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about Historians on Tap before we kind of wind it down for the show here, because that's how professionally, like obviously Matt's spoken at that, but like that's how the three of us kind of came together in this way, was we got a chance to do your show.
Right. So Historians on Tap kind of came out of me hanging out with some of my colleagues down there, Anne-Marie Kierlason, who was with the Piedmont Heritage Area at the time, although she's now with the Virginia State Arboretum, and Joe Rizzo, who's down at the Wilton House in Richmond now. The three of us were friends. We're historians. We like to hang out. We like to drink beer. We'd sit and...
Solid.
You guys know how... you're doing research, you find some weird little story that you want to tell, but it's not like enough for a paper or a panel or something like that. And we're like, well, why don't we share these stories, but do it in a way that's fun, that's not stuffy, that we can like go to a brewery or winery, distillery. There's so many of them in this area, and just talk to people about history that's not the kind of stuff you're going to read in a textbook. So, I mean, you guys have done a few of them with us. We talk about everything from murders. Dude,
you did the Newey murders, and I'm still in therapy. They're so grisly.
Yeah, that's one I like to hang on to because God, that's a good story.
You're like every Halloween, you're like, I'm gonna make everyone throw up.
Right. But even just these weird characters that we come across, like that, your privateer would be a perfect topic for Historians on Tap. I did one.
Yeah, but you like when I talk, like, how long do you like your average speaker to speak for? Like 20 minutes?
15 20 minutes.
I got like 8 minutes on Matthew Mangan, tops.
Keep digging.
Like we know his name.
Yeah.
And we don't. Like,
you said there's papers out there.
But that's the thing is like, I gotta ask our ambassador, Parker Russell, if I'm allowed to go to the University of Maine, because our producer, if you don't know this, the state of Maine has a president, and it's the producer of this show. He's actually, you're not allowed within the borders unless you ask our producer, Parker, permission.
He is Maine's biggest fan.
He owns Maine.
Awesome.
Yeah.
My family's from Maine. My dad's from Maine,
So you're familiar with the...
Guarantee you know Parker, and you've had to kiss the rings at some point.
No, I recently actually told a Maryland Revolutionary War story at a Historians on Tap. I talked about one of my favorite characters, William Augustus Bowles. He's a local guy born in Frederick County who ends up being a loyalist during the Revolutionary War, gets sent down with the Maryland Battalion to Florida during the war.
Wow.
Kind of ends
Spanish Florida?
It's British at the time.
Oh, right.
And he's in Pensacola when it's being besieged by the Spanish. He ends up kind of slipping out and hanging out with the Creek, and like marries into the Creek Nation, kind of begins to style himself as a chief of the Creek people. He's back and forth to England, to Canada, all over the world. He ends up getting arrested by the Spanish and sent to the Philippines. He's probably the first person from Frederick County to ever circumnavigate the globe, as far as I can tell.
Very non-traditionally.
Like this very interesting career of a guy who just kind of BS's his way into everything. Yeah, sure, I'm a chief of the Creek people. He just... he's talking to like the British government as if he has the authority.
This guy's my hero.
He's
instantly.
He's such an interesting guy. He ends up like real tragic story in the end, but fascinating dude.
What happens to him?
He dies in a prison in Cuba, in Havana. He's like gets arrested by the Spanish again, like one final time, and nobody breaks him out.
Stop messing with the Spanish, dude.
Yeah. Oh yeah, he's on his way back from the Philippines. He the ship gets into a naval battle, and he literally jumps ship and swims over to the other ship, and it's like a British ship, and he's like, "Hey, I'm the chief of the creek. You guys should take me back to London," and like all this stuff. Like, he is such a weird dude. Obviously I'm not doing a great job of telling his story now, but like William Bowles, check him out.
Oh, yeah,
He's
definitely.
a fascinating guy.
Absolutely.
One of my favorite Frederick history people.
That's
awesome. Any historians on tap coming up? By the time this episode is coming out, obviously, we're looking well into the calendar year 2025. Is your calendar that far out yet? Do you have anything for 2025?
Not yet.
Right,
Not yet.
In real time recording, it's spooky season.
Yeah.
In 2024.
Nothing yet, but you can find us on Facebook or Instagram, just Historians on Tap, and we usually pretty good about posting up. We try to stick in the Maryland, Northern Virginia area. We sometimes go as far down as Richmond. Mm-hmm. Just asked to do one up in Baltimore sometime soon. So just check our socials, and you'll find us there.
All right, make sure you do that. All right, well, speaking of socials, you're going to want to check ours as well. You're going to want to follow the History of Things podcast on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. So when you're done making sure that you click like, share, subscribe on all the Virginia Piedmont stuff and the Historians on Tap stuff, if you're not already doing that for us, how the hell did you get here? Make sure you're doing it by now. And then if you're looking to help the show, as always, make sure you're leaving those 5-star ratings and positive reviews. Reach out to us via email, historythingspodcast@gmail.com, or just write Matt a letter at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. He is the President of the United States of America. Boys,
I'd vote for him.
I would too.
I appreciate that.
I would too. Do we have anything before we get out of here for the rest of the day, Matt? Any final words on the revolution in Maryland?
No, just greatly appreciate you guys coming down, spending your time with us, sharing that knowledge, and we would love to have you guys back.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
Ian,
Love to be back.
We'll get you in studio soon. That way we can do this fully. So getting out of here for the day for our official guests today, Travis Shaw, for our tag team partner over here, Ian McDougall, for my co-host, Matt Borders. I'm your co-host, Pat McGuire. This has been the History of Things podcast saying we will catch you all later!
Have a good night.